Hello, and welcome. Tonight we journey far beyond the clouds, to the ancient heights of Mount Olympus, but not into thunder, not into battle. Instead, we walk alongside Zeus, not as a god of storms, but as a quiet witness of time. This is not a story of power. It is a story of presence, of silence, of breath. So settle in. Let the weight of your day fall away, and follow the stillness into the sky. Chapter 1. Dawn above the clouds. The sun had not yet risen over the mortal world, but high above, on Mount Olympus, the day was already stirring, softly, slowly, with the hush of golden mist curling over marble steps. Zeus, king of the gods, sat alone in the quietest part of his realm, a stone terrace draped in creeping vines and warmed by the eternal embers that never flickered. He was not majestic in this moment, not thunderous or terrible. He was simply awake, barefoot, robed in a linen tunic the color of overripe olives, one hand wrapped around a shallow bowl of warm nectar, the other stroking the smooth feathers of an eagle resting nearby. The air smelled faintly of crushed laurel and mountain pine, stirred only by the gentle breeze that had yet to choose its direction. He did not speak. He did not need to. Olympus responded to him in silence. Clouds shifted their course around his presence, and even the marble columns leaned into his mood, warmer and less rigid than they might have been had his thoughts been stormy. But this morning his mind was still, not empty, but open. There were no immediate disputes between gods to settle, no impudent heroes demanding glory, no cities begging for rain or judgment. It was a rare kind of day, the kind that stretched lazily across the heavens, without a script. Zeus sipped slowly from his bowl, the nectar sweet and slow like summer's last honey, and exhaled through his nose. He appreciated quiet mornings. Not often, but when they came, he let them linger. From his vantage point, the mortal world was beginning to glow along the eastern rim of the earth. Thin orange spread across the edge like paint diluted in water. Zeus watched it with the gaze of someone who had seen it 1,000,000 times and still thought it beautiful. He admired how the colors layered, how they never rushed one another. The blues yielded to grays, the grays to peach, the peach to white gold, and finally, when Helios would wake and mount his chariot, there would be full sun. But for now it was still soft, still clean. He leaned back on his elbow, resting on cushions filled with mountain moss, and listened to the clouds roll gently below like waves in an unseen ocean. The only sound was the quiet tapping of the eagle's beak as it preened beneath his fingers. The gods were still asleep, or at least not stirring yet. Hermes sometimes darted about at this hour, restless and grinning, but Zeus suspected even the messenger had taken a slow start. Hera, as ever, would be rising precisely at the sun's peak on the pillar behind her garden. Athena might already be awake, though she would not emerge until her owl returned from its silent night watch. Dionysus, no doubt, was sleeping off another night of revelry, somewhere under a heap of vines and unfinished poems. And Apollo, dear radiant Apollo, was likely stretching his limbs, yawning into his golden mirror, unaware that the world had already begun to glow without his touch. Zeus chuckled quietly, not mockingly, fondly. He took another sip of nectar. His eagle nestled in closer, tucking its head beneath one wing, feathers ruffling softly. Zeus closed his eyes, not to sleep, but to feel the moment more fully. He listened, not with ears, but with his deeper knowing. The rustle of pomegranate leaves far across the mountaintop, the distant hum of Poseidon's waves, heavy and slow beneath the cliffs, even the faint whisper of prayer rising from a small shrine in a shepherd's field below. It was not a request, not a plea, just thanks for weather, for warmth, for waking. Zeus accepted it silently, as he always did. No lightning, no voice from the sky, Just the quiet flick of his fingers, a breeze through the valley, a good day promised. Above him, the sky began to open its color. Pale blue spread thinly behind drifting clouds. The sun touched the tips of Olympus with light like stretched gold. Zeus remained still. There was no reason to rise yet. The day would come in its own time. He had lived too long to rush a sunrise. Zeus slowly leaned forward, setting his half-emptied bowl of nectar on a low, moss-covered table carved from petrified olive wood, one of the few objects on Olympus older than himself. The stone floor beneath his feet was still cool from the night mist, but it did not bother him. His toes curled slightly against it, feeling the slow breath of the mountain, the ancient heartbeat of the realm that existed between heavens and earth. He reached for a polished cloth, woven by the Hesperides long ago, and gently began wiping down the metal cylinder beside him. It was long, cold, and faintly humming. A thunderbolt, one of many. Not the largest, not the sharpest, but the one he favored for mornings like this, elegant, balanced, quiet. He worked with care, not reverence. For all his grandeur, Zeus was familiar with maintenance. Power, after all, was not in use alone, it was in stewardship. He rotated the thunderbolt slowly in his hands, smoothing a faint scratch along the copper edge. He remembered the time it had been made. The Cyclopes had handed it to him, still steaming from the forge. That day was far gone, just before the Titans fell. But the memory rested in the tool like a breath trapped in stone. His fingers moved almost without thought now, tracing grooves, adjusting small weights that kept the current aligned. The bolt would not be used today, perhaps not for a decade, but still it must be ready. That was the duty that remained, even when no conflict called behind him. The eagle shifted and let out a low whistle, then tucked its beak into the soft ruff of its chest. Zeus smiled and turned his gaze outward again. The mountain air had warmed slightly, rising with the coming sun. Clouds broke and curled along the ridges of Olympus like wool pulled from a loom. He could see the sleeping outline of temples far below, columns and rooftops peeking through drifting fog. Somewhere a rooster crowed. He listened to it not as a farmer might, but as a god who appreciated the steadiness of such cycles. Every crow was a promise kept, every dawn a wordless pact between life and light. Not divine, perhaps, but dependable. He turned the bolt once more and set it aside, nestled into a holder shaped like a curled ram's horn. From another small chest, he drew a scroll, not a proclamation, not a divine command, but a record of clouds. He had kept it himself for centuries. Every unusual wind, every long drought, every storm with personality. He unfolded the parchment slowly, his eyes scanning the ancient charcoal notations. He added a line in soft gray ink, dawn mist, persistent, sweet with laurel. A small note, but worth remembering. The day had a softness to it that felt old. Not tired, just timeless. Footsteps echoed faintly across the marble far behind him. Soft, quick, undecided. Hermes, of course. The messenger never truly slept, but he did vanish now and then, usually to chase an idea or gamble with fate. Zeus did not turn around. Instead, he raised one hand slightly, a gesture more like acknowledgement than greeting. Hermes paused a moment before saying anything. He had the sense, at least, to lower his tone when Olympus was still wrapped in sleep. Nothing urgent, he said, voice like running water. Just a whisper from a king in the east. He wants his olive trees to bloom early. Something about impressing a guest. Zeus did not answer at first. He looked at the scroll in his lap, then toward the slopes of the mountain, where the olive trees on Olympus still wore frost from the night. Too early, he said simply. The roots still dream. Hermes, always restless, shifted his weight from one foot to the other, wings on his ankles flexing with impatience. "Should I tell him that?" Zeus smiled faintly. "No. Tell him to wait." Hermes nodded once and disappeared with the faintest shimmer of sandals, leaving behind only the scent of mint and wind. Zeus folded the scroll and leaned back again. His shoulders settled into the cushions. The air around him swelled with warmth. The sun had now lifted fully into the sky, its light no longer shy. Olympus glowed white and gold. The quiet of early morning was ending, but the peace remained. He would stay here a little longer, in this narrow moment between stillness and motion. The day was his to shape, but for now he would simply watch it unfold. The clouds continued to drift lazily beneath the terrace, occasionally parting to reveal scattered glimpses of the mortal world below. Silver rivers reflecting the dawn light, small villages waking slowly with smoke rising from hearths, the flicker of torches as temple priests opened gates to empty courtyards. Zeus let his gaze pass over these scenes without judgment, without urgency. He had long since released the need to observe everything closely. There had been a time when every flick of mortal fate had demanded his attention. Every oath, every sacrifice, every tremble of fear beneath the sacred sky. But now he watched more like an old shepherd who trusts the hills to hold their own, stepping in only when the storm threatens the route. From far to the west, a deep, low hum began to roll in, a sound not from thunder but from the sea. It was Poseidon, stirring in his palace below the waves. The ocean god never rose quickly, preferring to stretch his reach across the tides before lifting his voice to the sky. Zeus recognized the rhythm immediately. Not anger, not summoning, just presence. A tide turning with old purpose. Somewhere the dolphins would begin leaping. Somewhere the sea would swell a little higher along its ancient curve. He respected his brother's steadiness. They rarely spoke directly these days. There was no need. Their understanding had aged like wine sealed in stone. Sharp once, now smooth and deep, still powerful. Zeus stood at last, slowly, his muscles heavy with age and memory, but strong all the same. The robe he wore shifted with the wind, revealing his bare ankles, the marks of time etched faintly into his skin. He took a long breath, the kind that reached the center of the chest and expanded outward like the growth of an oak. Around him the air responded. Leaves above rustled more brightly. The columns warmed beneath his fingertips. The sky shifted hue again. Less gold now, more radiant blue, clear and unwavering. Morning had fully arrived. He walked without hurry across the terrace, his steps soundless but firm. The eagle followed behind, hopping once, then taking flight with a single beat of its wings, circling above him. Zeus paused beneath an arch wrapped in ivy, where a stone bowl held the morning's first condensation. A small pool of water fed only by breath and night. He dipped his fingers into it and touched his forehead. A silent gesture, older than even the myths that bore his name. It was not worship. It was simply a habit, one that began when the world was still ash and sky, when even gods needed grounding. Far beyond the terrace, Olympus had begun to wake. Soft music echoed faintly from a courtyard where the muses practiced without audience. Somewhere, Dionysus laughed in his sleep. A white deer trotted across a cloud bridge, likely conjured by Artemis in a moment of early dreaming. The gods were not loud, not yet, but they were present. The mountain pulsed with their presence. Not in chaos, but in layers. Every god, every nymph, every ancient presence folded into the stillness, like spices hidden in warm bread. Zeus passed beneath the first archway into the colonnade, his hands brushing the stone walls with casual affection. He remembered when these halls had first risen, when he and his siblings carved Olympus from mist and marble, shaping it not just as a home, but as a place of balance. That was a long time ago, before temples and wars and songs. Now the halls echoed less, softened by centuries of tread, warmed by millennia of being lived in. They no longer rang with authority. They hummed with continuity. He paused at a basin set into the wall, dipped his hand, and washed his face slowly. No ritual, no grand gesture, just water, just breath, just another beginning. Behind him, the eagle landed again on its perch and tucked its wings. The sun had reached the upper sky now, casting bright bands of light through the arched windows. Zeus looked into it, not boldly, not defiantly, but with calm recognition. Another day had begun, not filled with lightning or decree, just rhythm, just watching, just being. He stepped back out into the open air, and Olympus greeted him. The clouds moved aside. The sky widened. The mountain, as ever, held steady. Chapter 2: Midday Silence. By the time the sun had settled into its quiet peak above the sky, the palace on Mount Olympus was filled with light, not loud or scorching, but even and golden, like the slow warmth of aged amber. Zeus sat once again on the eastern side of the mount, where the wind came less often and the stillness was deeper. The halls behind him had stirred briefly, echoes of laughter from Apollo, the quick voice of Hermes passing through, but they quieted again. Midday on Olympus had a rhythm of its own. Not all gods honored it, but Zeus did. For him, this hour had long been a kind of retreat, not from duty, but from noise. He did not sleep at midday. He listened. The terrace where he sat now was smaller, tucked between two columns and half-wrapped in ivy that had grown untouched for a century or more. He had chosen it precisely for that reason. The ivy, the silence, the light. Together they created a moment where the world felt paused, not frozen. He laid one hand across a smooth marble bench, fingers tracing grooves left by time and weather. This was not the throne of Olympus, not the great platform where the heavens bent toward his word. This was a smaller seat, built not for ruling but for observing. A low table nearby held a bowl of pomegranate seeds, a small folded scroll, and nothing else. The shadows on the ground had stilled. The air was warm but motionless. Zeus leaned back and closed his eyes, not in fatigue, but in patience. Around him, Olympus breathed softly. The birds, fewer now in summer's rise, chirped only occasionally, as if honoring the silence. Somewhere below, Pan's flute drifted lazily between clouds, its melody fragile as mist. Farther still, a mortal bell rang faintly from a hillside temple, the sound so distant that it came like a ripple in water. Zeus did not strain to hear. He let the sounds come or go as they pleased. That was the lesson of midday. You do not chase quiet. You make space and let it arrive. The eagle returned, perching on a carved railing and preening without hurry. Its presence grounded the scene, a familiar rhythm. It did not screech, did not demand. Simply was. Zeus regarded it for a moment, then turned his gaze outward once more. The world below had shifted. Shadows shortened, rooftops shone. The rivers no longer shimmered with gold, but flowed like veins of silver light. Fields were green and stretching. Mortals, if they were wise, had paused their work for rest. In the cities, merchants likely stood in doorways, wiping sweat from their brows. Shepherds might have found shade. Children, if free, would chase the edge of fountains. He imagined all this, not in detail, but in brushstrokes. Life continuing, quiet but full. He reached for the scroll on the table and unfolded it slowly. It was not official, no divine decree or mortal petition. Just a list, written in his own hand, of places to remember. Not because they needed tending, because they mattered. A grove where Athena once planted an olive that never stopped growing. A cliffside where Demeter once sat and wept into the wind. A cove where Hestia built her first hearth. They were places that still held the echo of meaning. He read the names silently, letting each one draw a picture in his mind. He did not need to visit them. Remembering was enough. Time passed, though he did not mark it. The sun held its place with the dignity of something that did not need to be rushed. The air stayed warm, the clouds white and soft. Zeus sat as he had for centuries. Neither king nor storm, but presence. Nothing stirred urgently. No prayers cried upward. No omens took shape in the skies. Just peace. The kind of peace that is not empty but full of detail. A breeze lifted a corner of the scroll, then let it fall again. Somewhere far off, a fountain laughed. The quiet remained undisturbed. A stillness that stretched beyond the terrace and out into the clouds like a well-woven cloth, perfectly unwrinkled. Zeus moved only slightly, adjusting the way his arm rested along the stone bench, letting the warmth of the marble soak into his skin. Even gods appreciated comfort, though they seldom admitted it. He looked up toward the sky, not for signs, not for omens, but simply to observe. Above him, a single hawk circled slowly, its wings held steady in the pale blue. The bird made no sound, but its shadow passed now and then across the floor, flickering like a soft echo of motion in an otherwise frozen hour. A soft rustling sound from within the vines told Zeus he was no longer entirely alone. He did not turn. He already knew who it was. Hera's footsteps were too precise, too deliberate. The sound was gentler, more like wind brushing silk. It was Hestia, the goddess of the hearth, the quiet flame, and the home. Of all the Olympians, she was the one he shared the most silences with. She did not speak at first. She merely approached and settled onto the curved bench opposite his own. No formality, no announcement, just presence. Between them, the pomegranate seeds remained untouched. Hestia reached forward and took one, holding it delicately between her fingers before placing it on her tongue. She chewed slowly, her gaze cast downward as though she were still tasting the memories that came with the fruit. "It's a good day," she said at last, her voice barely louder than the breeze. Zeus nodded once. "It is." He didn't elaborate. With Hestia, he never had to. She understood that stillness did not need to be filled, that words were sometimes more effort than ease. The warmth she brought was subtle, like the steady glow of a hearth that never needed to roar. They sat together without conversation for some time. The eagle watched them both but did not move. On the scroll between them, the list of sacred places caught the light, edges curling just slightly with the midday air. Hestia's eyes moved over the ink. "You still keep this?" she murmured, not as a question, more as an observation. Zeus looked at the scroll and smiled faintly. "Some places remember us longer than others," he said. "It's good to remember them back." She nodded and reached out to gently flatten the edge that had lifted. Her touch was always precise, never rushed, never careless. Far below the mountain, a distant breeze carried the sound of flutes. Perhaps Apollo's students rehearsing, or perhaps Pan again, wandering the lower slopes. Either way, the melody drifted just close enough to reach them, then passed on, like a thought that had no need to stay. Hestia closed her eyes. "I like the quiet here," she said softly. "It's not empty." Zeus considered that and agreed silently. It wasn't. It was full of breath and time and memory. It was the kind of quiet that held space for everything. Even gods who had lived too long to be surprised. Hestia stood eventually, brushing a bit of ivy from her robe, and looked down over the ledge. "The mortals have begun lighting their hearths again," she said. "Even in summer." not for warmth, but for presence. Zeus raised an eyebrow. Habit, she smiled. Ritual. And then, without farewell, she turned and walked back into the shade of the corridor, her form melting gently into the light. Zeus remained still. A single pomegranate seed rested in the bowl, its color deep and red and quiet. He picked it up between his fingers and held it to the sun. The juice inside glowed like a ruby. He did not eat it. He simply looked. The moment passed and he set it down again. The wind returned, just slightly, enough to stir the vines, to lift the eagle's feathers. Zeus leaned back, the stone warming further behind him. He closed his eyes and did not sleep. He listened to everything and to nothing. The sun reached its quiet peak above Olympus, not casting down heat like a hammer, but spreading gently like a sheet of light folded over stone and cloud. Zeus remained still, not by command or ceremony, but simply because the stillness suited him. His breathing was slow and deep, in rhythm with the subtle pulse of the mountain. Around him, the world seemed to hold its breath, not out of fear or awe, but in shared reverence for the soft balance of midday. It was the hour when movement faded into presence, when action gave way to observation, and when even gods, especially gods, remembered that not every moment required thunder. A small cloud drifted lazily in front of the sun, casting a temporary shade over the terrace. Zeus opened his eyes but did not move. He watched the light shift across the stone, watched the eagle stretch its wings and resettle, watched the pomegranate seed roll slightly in its bowl from the breeze. He thought of the many days like this that had passed. Thousands, tens of thousands. And yet, each one had its own sound, its own scent, its own silence. This one carried something unusually soft in it, something like memory, but without the weight. A kind of clarity that comes not from effort, but from the simple act of letting the moment arrive. He stood slowly, stretching his arms not with force but with quiet care. His joints did not ache, but they remembered the years. The weight of immortality was not heavy on his bones. It lived elsewhere, deeper. He walked to the edge of the terrace and looked down, his gaze falling far beyond the cliffs and forests and fields, out to the glimmer of the distant sea. A ship moved slowly across the water, its sail catching the light. No prayer reached him from it. No danger called. It was just sailing, simple, purposeful, beautiful. He nodded once, as if in silent approval, though no one could see him. The wind picked up for a moment, then settled again. Behind him, a soft chime echoed through the corridors of Olympus, one of the muses marking the hour with a bronze bell. It was not loud, but it rang clear, threading through the air like silk through fingers. Zeus closed his eyes and let the sound pass through him. It marked nothing urgent. No meeting, no decision, just time. A simple announcement that the day had passed from ascent to descent. The peak was behind them now. From here, the light would begin to soften, the shadows to lengthen, the hush to deepen once again. He returned to the table and carefully rolled up the scroll, tying it with a faded green ribbon. He placed it back into its chest, then picked up the now warm bowl of nectar from earlier. He poured the last few sips out onto the stones, a gesture not of waste, but of offering, back to the mountain, back to the earth, back to whatever invisible rhythm still held all things together. The eagle blinked slowly, tilted its head, and gave a single soft cry, as if echoing the sentiment. Zeus reached out and ran his hand down the bird's back once. The feathers were warm and smooth beneath his palm. In the distance, clouds began to gather. Not darkly, not with storm, but with form. Shapes began to return to the sky, like thoughts slowly collecting. He watched them without concern. Whatever came, came slowly, Olympus did not rush. Its stones had stood through the rise and fall of cities, the birth and death of empires. Its halls had echoed with laughter, with prophecy, with silence. And now, once again, they held nothing but the soft voice of wind and the steady pulse of daylight. Zeus took a final breath of the midday air, now beginning to shift into the warm tones of afternoon. There was still no call for thunder, no plea for rain, no need for judgment or might, just the continuing of the day, unbroken, unworried, unwound. He stepped into the shade of the archway, his form casting a long, quiet shadow behind him. The eagle followed, and Olympus, as always, watched them go. Chapter 3. The Garden of Echoes. There was a place on Mount Olympus where no voices were raised, not by rule, but by nature. A quiet grove hidden between columns of marble and veils of ivy, where the air was thicker with time than with sound. The gods called it the Garden of Echoes, not because sound bounced back there, but because sound lingered. Whispers stayed long after they were spoken. Footsteps seemed to hum beneath the moss. Laughter, though rare, would drift gently between the stone trunks of ancient trees, growing fainter each time until it faded like mist. This was one of Zeus's favorite places, not because it was grand, but because it listened. He entered the garden alone. No eagle, no servants, no scrolls. Just himself, one hand resting on the folded sleeves of his robe, the other trailing gently along a low marble railing where dew still clung from the shaded air. The sunlight filtered differently here, not in bold shafts, but through layers of green and white and gold, as if Olympus itself remembered how to hush. The scent of laurel leaves mixed with crushed myrrh and cool stone. Even the bees flew slowly, unhurried in their gathering. Zeus walked without purpose, no destination, no task. Only the rhythm of slow steps, the pull of memory, and the breath of the afternoon. There were no statues in this garden, no tributes, no names carved in stone. Only natural growth, quiet structures, and paths worn smooth by centuries of divine footsteps. Near the center was a reflecting pool, not deep, not wide, but perfectly still. Its surface was so clear that clouds from above seemed to pause mid-flight as they passed across it. Zeus approached it slowly, his reflection emerging not as an image of power, but as a softened version of himself, older, not by age but by experience. He sat down on a wide, flat stone at the water's edge and let his feet rest on cool moss. The sound of his breath joined the hush of the trees, and he was content to let it be enough. It was here that Zeus often thought without the weight of his title, not as a king, not as a judge, but as a presence among other presences. He thought of the many voices that had passed through this grove. Demeter's gentle counsel, Artemis's silence, Hermes's rare moments of stillness, even Ares once, long ago, speaking not of war but of a dream he could not shake. Zeus never tried to hold these memories in place. They arrived like mist and left the same way. He welcomed them and let them go. That was the way of this garden. You could not grasp the echoes. You could only sit among them and let them rest against your skin like wind through linen. A single olive tree stood at the far end of the pool. It was not tall, but wide and full, its leaves silvered at the edges and always in motion even when no wind stirred. Athena had planted it long before temples and offerings. She had spoken no words as she pressed the seed into the soil. She had simply watched it grow. Now, the tree stood like a quiet witness, its roots wrapped around old stones, its branches casting patterned shadows across the water. Zeus looked at it for a long time, not thinking of Athena, not even of the tree, but simply observing its stillness. There was something comforting about the way it moved without effort. He leaned forward and scooped a handful of water from the pool, letting it spill slowly between his fingers. It left no mark, no ripple. The surface smoothed instantly, as if nothing had touched it at all. He exhaled. A soft sound. Barely a sound at all. But the garden heard it. Leaves rustled gently. A bird called once from deep within the grove. And somewhere behind him, though he did not turn to look, a voice long since faded whispered a line of poetry he could not quite recall. He smiled. Not everything needed remembering. Some things simply needed to be allowed. Zeus remained seated beside the reflecting pool, his eyes half closed, not in sleep, but in something gentler, an openness to the space around him. The air here carried no urgency, no expectation. It did not press for decision or offer distraction. It simply flowed, like a river that had forgotten its destination. A cicada hummed softly somewhere overhead, its voice steady and low, folding into the distant rustle of branches. Somewhere farther off, a fruit dropped soundlessly into the underbrush. The garden noticed, but did not react. That was the way of things here. No moment was ever larger than the space that held it. Zeus shifted slightly, stretching his legs across the moss and leaning back onto his hands. The stone beneath him had warmed from the filtered light, but just enough to be felt, not to press. His fingers brushed a small root that had pushed up through a crack in the flagstone, thin and pale, like a line of memory rising to the surface. He did not move it. He merely felt it, noting its stubborn gentleness, the way it grew quietly beneath the weight of all things. There was wisdom in that, not the loud kind sung by bards or written in scrolls. A deeper sort, the kind that simply endures. He remembered when this part of Olympus had first been shaped, before the grand halls, before the clouds were tamed. This garden had been a natural hollow between two peaks, nothing but wind and stone. He and his siblings had passed through it once, when the world was still raw and the stars had yet to take their patterns. It had been Hera, surprisingly, who suggested they leave it untouched. Even gods need places to go where they are not gods, she had said. At the time, he had only half listened. Now he understood. Places like this did not serve power. They served pause. The olive tree swayed again, its leaves casting shifting patterns across the pool's surface. Zeus watched as one leaf, loosened by time or breeze, detached and fell in slow spirals toward the water. It landed with barely a sound, but the ripple it made was precise. Concentric circles expanding gently across the mirrored sky. He followed them with his eyes until they dissolved back into stillness. Nothing dramatic, nothing divine, just the perfect geometry of motion and return. Even gods, he thought, might hope to live that way. Ripples, not storms, from the corner of the garden. A figure appeared, not walking, but drifting as if formed from the light itself. It was Mnemosyne, the Titaness of memory. She did not speak, but inclined her head in greeting, her face calm and unreadable. She rarely visited Olympus these days, preferring the quieter edges of thought and time. But sometimes, she passed through here, as though drawn to the echoes of what once was. Zeus did not rise. She did not expect him to. They simply shared the space, each absorbed in what it offered. Mnemosyne stepped to the other side of the pool and gazed into it, perhaps seeing more than water. Zeus often wondered what memories Mnemosyne chose to carry, whether she held only the large things, wars, births, alliances, or also the small. A hand held in silence, a phrase nearly forgotten, the feeling of dew on a stone bench at dawn. He hoped it was the latter. He had learned, over the long arc of time, that the smallest things endured the longest. The garden itself was proof. No marble statues, no towering reminders of glory, only light and leaves, and the sounds no one tried to keep. Mnemosyne eventually turned away, offering a parting glance before she melted once more into the shaded corridor of ivy and stone. Zeus remained still, not to wait for her return. She would return when memory called, but because the silence now felt fuller, as though it had accepted her presence and added it gently to its layers. The pool remained unchanged, the fallen leaf now floating quietly near the edge. Zeus let out a breath he had not realized he'd been holding. Not of tension, not of burden, just breath. He leaned forward once more, letting his fingertips rest on the ground, feeling its cool softness. There were many places on Olympus where a god could proclaim, command, transform. This was one of the few places where a god could simply be. A faint breeze stirred the upper leaves of the olive tree, and they shimmered in the light, scattering fragments of sun across the stone path. Zeus watched their flickering play without moving, letting the patterns drift across his skin like passing thoughts. The air was warmer now, touched by the edge of afternoon, but the garden remained cool in its shadows. There was no pressure in the moment. Nothing tugged at him. He had nowhere he was required to be, and no one was calling his name. Such stretches of time had grown rare, even for a god, and he chose to let this one last as long as it would. His gaze returned to the reflecting pool. The water was still again, the single fallen leaf having floated gently into the shade beneath a stone overhang. From this angle, the surface reflected not just the sky but hints of the surrounding marble, vines, and shadows. His own face stared back at him, soft and blurred by the slightest ripple. It was a kind face, though tired, less like the one carved into statues, and more like one remembered in silence. He raised a hand slowly and dipped his fingers into the water, breaking the image without regret. He had never needed to cling to it. A cicada started again, this time closer. Its rhythm was patient, unhurried. The sound filled the edges of the garden without disrupting its stillness. Zeus listened carefully. There was something almost sacred in the simplicity of it. Life reduced to a tone, repeating itself without variation, like a prayer with no words. It reminded him that even small things claimed space in the world, not by force but by persistence. He nodded slightly, as if acknowledging the insect's presence, and leaned back on his hands once again. The garden had changed little over the centuries. Occasionally, a vine would stretch farther than before, or a crack in the stone would deepen slightly, but nothing here grew with haste. It was a place of slow unfolding, the kind of place that rewarded stillness. Zeus had tried once to bring others here. Artemis, who always moved too quickly. Hermes, who could not sit through silence. Even Apollo, who had admired the space but found it too quiet for his taste. Only Hestia had returned, and only rarely. That was fine. The garden did not require company. It welcomed only presence. He stood at last, stretching his arms slowly overhead, his shoulders easing back with a quiet crack that sounded almost like a sigh. The movement stirred the eagle, who had landed silently nearby, its golden eyes half closed in rest. It shifted one wing and tilted its head, watching without expectation. Zeus offered no command. There was none to give. He simply let his fingers graze the top of the creature's head in a brief gesture of shared awareness before turning once more to the path that wound out of the garden. The stones beneath his feet were familiar. Each one had held his step countless times before. As he walked, the echoes followed, not of voices, but of the garden itself. The way it held silence, and how that silence pressed gently against him like the hush of deep water. He thought briefly of how few places in the world still offered such stillness. Even among mortals, quiet had become something rare, not for its absence of noise, but for its space. Here, though, that space remained, and it had reminded him, once again, of something he often forgot. Not all strength lies in sound. At the edge of the garden, where the stone gave way to a narrow archway leading back toward the colonnade, he paused. One last glance over his shoulder showed the pool, the olive tree, the quiet. It was unchanged. It would remain so. With a final breath drawn deep into his chest, he stepped beyond the ivy-draped entrance, letting the light of the open sky find his shoulders again. Behind him, the echoes folded gently back into the air, not as farewells, but as continuations. Olympus carried on. Chapter 4: Tools of the Sky. The corridor leading away from the garden wound gently around the outer edge of Olympus, opening gradually onto a higher terrace lined with weathered pillars and stone benches polished by time. Here, the mountain felt closer to the sky. The clouds below looked thinner, stretched like parchment, and the wind carried a cleaner scent. Less of laurel and moss, more of altitude and distant rain. It was a quiet place, but not soft like the garden. This space was clearer, more structured. It had a purpose, even if that purpose was no longer urgent. This was where Zeus kept the tools of his station. Not hidden, not locked away, but resting in their own kind of stillness. At the center of the terrace stood a wide, flat table carved from obsidian and inlaid with silver lines that formed constellations. It was older than the palace itself, shaped during a time when stars had only just begun to settle into patterns. Upon it lay the instruments not of war, but of weather, guidance, and balance. There were thunderbolts, yes, each distinct in form and weight, but also smaller objects. A rainstone wrapped in golden thread, a bronze sphere used to track winds across distant deserts, and a collection of finely carved rods that shimmered faintly when storm fronts stirred. They were not arranged with military precision, but with careful familiarity. Each item had its place, and each one knew it. Zeus approached the table slowly, as if returning to a conversation that had been paused rather than ended. His fingers hovered over the tools, not with hesitation, but with memory. He picked up a small rod, lighter than a feather, made of white crystal. When turned at a particular angle, it caught sunlight and split it into thin lines of color, each one vibrating at a slightly different pitch, inaudible to mortals but deeply familiar to him. He held it to his ear and listened. The sounds were not music, not exactly. More like the memory of wind before a storm, or the stillness of sky after lightning. He nodded once, then set it down gently. The tools had not been used often in recent ages. Mortals now looked to their own instruments, their own measurements and maps. They no longer called to him for each change in the weather, for every fork of lightning or failed harvest. He did not resent this. It was the natural order of things. Time had its shape, and he had long since learned not to press against it. Still, he kept the tools clean, aligned, ready. Not because he expected chaos, but because he honored what they meant. They were not weapons. They were responsibilities. He reached next for one of the thunderbolts. Not the heaviest, not the sharpest. This one had a slight bend in its shaft, from where it had once struck the edge of a mountain and ricocheted into the sea. Its metal was dark, almost blue in the right light, and when he gripped it, it hummed gently, recognizing his hand. He turned it slowly, watching how the etched lines along its side caught the shifting sky. This bolt had not been thrown in centuries, but it remembered flight. It always would. Zeus smiled faintly and set it back down. Far off, he could see clouds gathering over the western edge of the horizon. Not storm clouds, just the soft buildup of evening air, rising from the sea and curling toward the peaks. He walked to the edge of the terrace and placed both hands on the stone railing, looking out. From here, the world stretched in all directions, layered in haze and sunlight. The cities were dots, the rivers, threads. The mortal world no longer called to him as it once had, but it was still familiar. still his to watch, not to rule with noise and fire, but to guide gently when needed. He stood there for some time, breathing in the thin air and listening, not for voices but for shifts in pressure, in tone, in rhythm. The sky had a song, even in silence, especially in silence. He had learned to hear it long ago, when the world was young and full of motion. Now it was softer, but no less present. The tools behind him shimmered faintly in the slanting sun, like old friends waiting without question. Zeus stepped away from the edge and returned to the obsidian table, where the tools rested in a kind of patient silence. Each object held a story, not one etched in grand epics, but in the quiet lineage of function and presence. He picked up a small stone that fit perfectly in his palm, its surface smooth and marked with a spiral that glowed faintly in the sun. It was called a rainstone, though mortals would have mistaken it for polished river rock. When turned gently in the hand, it resonated with the moisture in the air, not changing it, but sensing it, like a muscle learning the pressure of a coming storm. Zeus rotated it once, felt its faint warmth, and smiled. The air was balanced. The stone confirmed what he already knew. He set it back in place and reached for a bowl filled with fine metallic dust. It shimmered like powdered lightning, glowing softly in shades of silver and copper. He dipped 2 fingers into it, then blew gently across the surface. The dust scattered in a thin cloud, rising momentarily before dissolving. Where it vanished, he saw patterns form, trails in the sky, lines of heat, the slow curl of a future breeze that had not yet arrived. These were not predictions. They were tendencies, possibilities. Zeus did not believe in certainty. He believed in presence and in preparedness. He wiped his hands on a cloth woven from sun-dried flax, then carefully adjusted the bowl so the dust settled evenly once more. Next to the bowl was a single strand of golden wire, so thin it was nearly invisible unless held in just the right light. It was coiled like a thread and tied at one end to a pebble no larger than a grain of barley. This was a measure of stillness, an old tool once used to mark the balance between movement and rest. If left untouched on the table, the wire would rise and fall with the air, indicating whether the sky itself was leaning towards silence or shift. Zeus crouched to eye level with it and waited. The wire barely moved. A slow rise, a slower fall. Stillness, but not stagnation. The mountain breathed in its own rhythm. From a shelf beneath the table, he pulled a narrow wooden case wrapped in faded red cloth. Inside were tablets, flat, rectangular pieces of pressed cloudstone, etched faintly with markings that changed depending on weather, time of day, and emotion. They were not oracles. They were records. Zeus flipped one over slowly and watched as a pale image formed on the surface. A mountain surrounded by still water, clouds hanging low and unmoving. It was not Olympus. It was somewhere else. A place of long-ago memory, perhaps. The tablets sometimes revealed landscapes he did not recognize, as if reflecting not just his own thoughts but echoes from the air itself. He replaced the tablet and folded the cloth again, fingers brushing over the soft wear of centuries. These tools had traveled with him through ages, across skies, through storms, along winds that had long since forgotten their own direction. They had been handled by Cyclopes, polished by Hesperides, sung over by muses. But now they rested here, still and unassuming, like guardians not of power, but of awareness. Zeus respected that. He understood that the sky did not need to be commanded. It needed to be known. He stood upright once more, the sun now casting long shadows across the terrace. The wind picked up slightly, brushing his robes and lifting the edges of the cloth-covered case. The eagle, silent and watchful, landed softly on the far end of the table, tilting its head as if examining the arrangement of instruments. Zeus smiled at the bird's quiet curiosity. "Still balanced," he said aloud, though softly. The eagle blinked once and settled in. As afternoon deepened, he looked once more at the western sky, where the clouds had gathered in soft waves. Not thick enough for storm, but full enough to hold light differently. It was the kind of sky that made mortals pause and wonder if rain might come. Not out of fear, but anticipation. Zeus did not move to change it. He merely watched. If a breeze came, it would come on its own. If rain followed, it would follow in its time. Behind him, the tools shimmered faintly again, then quieted. They would remain, as always, waiting. Zeus lingered a moment longer before stepping away from the table, leaving the instruments exactly as they were. He did not need to reorder them. Their stillness held their purpose. As he moved across the terrace, the wind shifted just slightly, brushing past his shoulder and curling along the stone floor like a ribbon of invisible thread. He paused mid-step, recognizing the subtle shift. Not a warning, not even a message, just a breath. The sky had spoken in a way it often did, wordless, measured, expectant. Zeus tilted his head, listening more with his body than his ears. There was no storm approaching, only the possibility of movement. He turned toward a tall, slender spire at the edge of the terrace, a structure of translucent stone shaped like a spiraled funnel, narrowing at the top. It was one of the oldest constructs on Olympus, built not by design but grown through the shaping of wind and thought. The spire did not hum or glow or spin. It simply stood, capturing patterns from the air around it. Zeus reached its base and placed one hand against its smooth surface. A warmth greeted him, not heat, but resonance. A low, steady vibration like the purring of clouds in rest. He closed his eyes, letting his own rhythm sync with it for a moment, drawing comfort from the sky's even breath nearby. A wide basin carved from white stone held droplets of condensation, gathered not from rain but from the tension between heat and height. This water was precious, not in its rarity, but in its clarity. Contained nothing but sky. Zeus dipped his fingers into it and let it run slowly down his wrist, where it left behind a shimmer of light. He rubbed his hands together slowly and then held them out toward the open air, palms up. A few moments passed. Then the faintest breeze responded, curling into his hands and then rising, drifting outward. It wasn't a ritual. It wasn't magic. It was acknowledgement. Mutual. Zeus looked out once more, this time toward the distant southern horizon. There, the sea sparkled with late sun, and a single cloud bank rose above it, tall, soft, tinged with peach. It would not reach the land today. It would linger over the waves, casting slow-moving shadows across the backs of dolphins and the sails of quiet ships. Mortals might glance upward and wonder at its beauty. A few might thank the gods. Most would not. Zeus did not mind. The sky did not demand praise. It simply continued. Returning to the center of the terrace, he picked up one final object. A narrow scroll tube carved from petrified driftwood, capped in bronze. It was light in weight, but heavy in memory. Inside were not decrees or prophecies, but his own notes, observations from ages past when he had tracked not storms or seasons, but subtler patterns. How the air changed when grief lingered in a city, how thunder rolled differently when mortals prayed in anger rather than awe. He had filled these scrolls not for power, but for understanding. He held it now and tapped it gently against his palm, considering whether today required an entry. He set it back down. The day had spoken clearly already. It had not asked to be recorded. It had only asked to be seen. The tools around him shimmered once more in the amber light. The dust had settled. The thread of gold still lifted and dropped gently with the air's pulse. Everything remained in balance. not because of him but with him. As he turned to leave, the eagle took flight once more, wings wide and slow, cutting across the low clouds with ease. Zeus followed its movement with his eyes, then walked back along the path toward the colonnade, the terrace behind him glowing softly as the sun began its slow descent. He carried no tools with him. He left them behind, not abandoned, but trusted. They would wait in the stillness, listening to the sky, ready for when they were needed again. And the sky, as ever, would continue its quiet work, cloud by cloud, breath by breath, hour by golden hour. Chapter 5. Conversations with Light. The late afternoon on Olympus arrived not as a sudden shift, but as a gentle easing, light softening along the marble walls, shadows stretching longer and cooler, the sun slanting low with practiced grace. For Zeus, this was a sacred time, not because of ceremony or tradition, but because it marked the threshold between clarity and reflection. It was the hour when the mountain's brightness began to mellow, and colors turned from brilliant white to honey gold, like thoughts settling after long attention. He often spent these hours in a quiet corridor that opened westward, where the light poured through open arches and painted the floors with ribbons of warmth. Today, as he entered the space, the light greeted him in a familiar rhythm, gold and amber layered over the white stone, the shadows of climbing vines creating slow-moving patterns across the floor. The air was still warm, but calmer than it had been on the higher terraces. A breeze moved through occasionally, stirring the curtains of woven reeds that hung along the archways, whispering gently as if carrying words that refused to form. Zeus did not need the wind to speak. He only needed it to be there. He lowered himself onto a low seat carved from dark olive wood, polished smooth over centuries by his own hands. The seat was positioned so that the light would wash over his left shoulder, the warmth familiar, consistent. He reached to the side, where a shallow bowl of honeyed figs rested on a stand. He took one and bit slowly, savoring the sweetness, letting it melt on his tongue. The fruit was not just food, it was time. Time preserved, ripened, offered without expectation. As he chewed, he let his eyes drift across the corridor. The interplay of light and form here had always fascinated him. Not for its grandeur, but for its simplicity. A square of light broken by a vine. A streak of sun on ancient tile. The fading outline of a tree branch shadow growing thinner as the sun continued its descent. These were the conversations he had come to prefer, spoken not in language but in pattern. In one corner of the corridor stood a shallow reflecting urn, filled not with water but with fine glass spheres. Each sphere was slightly different, some clear, others tinged faintly with blue, green, or gold. When the light struck them at just the right angle, they refracted and cast slivers of color across the walls. Zeus had collected them over ages, not for their origin, but for their behavior. He watched as one, resting near the rim, caught a beam of light and sent a single stripe of pale violet up the wall, where it danced across the ceiling in a slow, spinning arc. He followed its movement with the same care one might give a bird in flight, alert, engaged, entirely at peace. Sometimes he thought of this place as a kind of sundial, though it told not time but mood. The way the light shifted revealed more than hours. It revealed the mountain's posture, the day's temperament, the sky's quiet commentary on what had passed. Today, the light was low and warm, steady, reflective. It was the kind of light that lingered, even after it was gone. He let it fall over his hands, noticing how the veins beneath his skin glowed faintly. The hands that had once held storms now rested in stillness, washed by gold. He reached for another fig, slower this time, and let his eyes close halfway. In the filtered sunlight, sound seemed farther away, voices muffled, Footsteps softened, the wind barely more than a suggestion. This corridor was not silent, but it respected silence. It held a stillness that was never empty, only waiting. It was here that Zeus often came not to think, but to stop thinking. The light did the rest. It touched his shoulders and reminded him he was here, not as king, not as wielder of thunder, but as one more presence in the slow movement of the day. And the day, in its golden decline, welcomed him. The light continued its slow descent, angling deeper into the corridor until it touched the very base of the columns that lined the outer edge. It caught in the grooves of old stone, highlighting the imperfections that time had etched into the marble. Not damage, but history. Zeus opened his eyes fully again, watching the golden outlines sharpen and shift as the sun moved toward the horizon. He knew these changes by heart. Every day Olympus turned with the sky, and yet it never felt repetitive. Each afternoon light arrived with subtle variation. Sometimes more yellow, sometimes almost silver, sometimes thin as thread, and other days like flowing honey. Today's light was soft, quiet, and patient. From a nearby alcove, a breeze carried the scent of warmed cedar and distant myrtle. Somewhere below in the groves, the dry needles had begun to release their resin into the air, and the scent climbed the mountain like a memory. Zeus took a slow breath through his nose, letting the warmth and scent blend with the rhythm of light. It reminded him faintly of summers long gone, times when the gods walked among mortals more openly, their laughter echoing through hills and forests, their shadows stretching long across festival fires. Those days had passed not with finality, but with quiet migration. Now they lived only in the light and in the things it remembered. He rose from the olive-wood seat and stepped further into the light, allowing it to wrap gently around his shoulders. His robe shimmered slightly in the glow, not as a display, but as a natural response. Threads woven with starlight centuries ago, now glowing faintly in the hour that welcomed reflection. The corridor beneath his feet was made of pale stone tiles, each laid by hand in a pattern that mimicked the flow of wind. It was said that when walked in silence, the path resonated with the same frequency as the breeze outside. He moved slowly now, barefoot, each step landing softly, his weight balanced between heel and arch. The floor responded just slightly, almost musically, as if greeting an old friend. On the western wall, above a stretch of flowering vines, hung a series of thin copper discs suspended on delicate threads. These were sun catchers, crafted not for ornament but for dialogue. Each one was tuned to a different hue of light. When the sun struck them just so, they vibrated, not with sound, but with motion, each one rotating gently, casting soft reflections and long, trembling glows along the floor and walls. Zeus paused in front of them now, watching how 3 of the discs had begun to move together. Their rhythm matched as if guided by an unseen melody. He did not touch them. They would move as they were meant to, responding only to sky and time. He remembered the day the first disc had been hung there. It had been Hephaestus's idea centuries ago, after a long conversation about the weight of metal and the nature of light. "Let the sky speak through silence," the craftsman had said. And so, they had created these instruments not to be played but to be listened to. Over time, the others had been added, each one shaped by a different phase of sunlight. The pale blue of morning, the amber of midday, the deep crimson of dusk. Now they turned gently in the current of fading afternoon, like petals on invisible water. The sun touched the edge of the far peaks now, its color beginning to deepen. Shadows stretched longer, and the golden light that had filled the corridor took on a softer, more diffused tone. Less declarative, more contemplative. Zeus stood still in its center, letting it fall across his face. It warmed his cheeks and eyelids, It traced the lines time had left near his mouth and eyes. But it did not judge those lines. It illuminated them. The light, like Olympus itself, carried no opinion, only presence. He closed his eyes again, but this time the colors danced behind them. Reds and oranges, faint flickers of violet. A quiet kaleidoscope, drawn not by flame or storm, but by a star slowly retreating from the day. He remained still as the corridor shifted into evening, and the light, as always, continued to speak, without voice, without urgency, and with infinite patience. As the sun neared the horizon and its light grew dimmer, the corridor embraced the transition with grace. The golden warmth that had bathed the floor now gave way to softer, cooler hues, rose, then lavender, and finally a quiet blue that edged the columns like watercolor. The light no longer poured in. It filtered gently, slipping between leaves and marble like the end of a lullaby. Zeus remained standing, still in the same place, not because he was waiting, but because the moment had not yet fully finished. There was a satisfaction in letting light complete its journey, in watching the sky carry the sun over the world like a candle being drawn from a room. A single copper disc near the top of the corridor caught a final angle of sunlight and spun once, slowly. Its reflection danced across the wall, flickering against the vines, then vanished. That was how twilight arrived here. Not in darkness, but in the fading of gold. Zeus inhaled deeply, his lungs expanding with air now tinged by evening. The corridor cooled by degrees, and the floor beneath him felt less like stone and more like memory. He stepped forward again, each motion slow and thoughtful, his feet marking the shifting rhythm of the hour. This was no procession, no ceremony. It was simply the act of continuing. He reached the far end of the corridor where the walls gave way to an open balcony overlooking the western slope of Olympus. The view was wide, unobstructed, and drenched in the layered hues of sunset. Far below, valleys were bathed in bronze light. Hills turned to shadow. The sea, barely visible in the distance, shimmered once and then stilled. He leaned forward on the stone railing, letting the wind meet his chest, his eyes fixed on the line where sky met world. This was not the moment for thunder or command. This was the moment for stillness. And stillness, Zeus had come to understand, required presence more than power. He often thought of the mortals during these moments, not as subjects or petitioners, but as witnesses to the same sun, the same horizon. Somewhere, a shepherd was folding his cloak over his shoulders as the air cooled. A child was being called inside by the soft voice of a parent. A traveler paused on a hilltop, uncertain whether to make camp or keep walking. All of them bathed in the same light, unaware of the God watching from above. He smiled faintly at that, not out of amusement but out of shared experience. The beauty of light was that it touched everyone, God or mortal, without distinction. Behind him, the corridor had grown still and dim, the discs now quiet, their movements suspended in shadow. The breeze carried fewer scents now, just the faint resin of pine, the mineral note of stone cooling beneath the sky. It was nearly night. Zeus stood in that thin stretch between day and darkness, aware of the shift but not hurrying it. He did not fear the evening. He did not resist the end of light. He had seen it thousands of times in 1,000 forms, and each one was different. Each one held something sacred. He stepped back from the railing, his robes brushing softly against the smooth stone. One last glance at the fading sky revealed the first star, a soft glint just above the horizon. Not the brightest, not yet, but the first. It hung there gently, quietly, as though shy of being noticed. Zeus bowed his head slightly, a nod not of reverence but of welcome. Then, without sound, he turned and walked back into the corridor. now illuminated only by reflection and memory. The copper discs no longer shimmered, but they remembered the light. The walls no longer glowed, but they remembered the warmth. And Zeus, walking alone, carried both with him into the deepening evening. Chapter 6. Dreams Without Sleep. Night on Olympus did not fall like a curtain, nor did it arrive in sudden silence. It unfolded gradually, like a soft fabric being pulled across the sky, layer by layer, star by star. By the time the sun had disappeared completely beyond the western peaks, the halls and terraces of the mountain were bathed in a deep twilight glow. The air cooled, and with it came a new kind of stillness, not the quiet of inactivity, but the hush of inward turning. Even the gods, for all their restlessness and fire, grew gentler at night. And Zeus, too, felt the pull of it, not toward slumber but toward reflection. He did not sleep often, and when he did, it was not like mortals dreamed. His rest was deeper than dreams and quieter than thought. But on most nights he did not seek sleep at all. Instead, he walked, slowly, deliberately, through the oldest corridors of Olympus, places rarely visited, where the walls held echoes even older than the gods themselves. These spaces were carved not of marble but of shadow, smoothed by time and memory, and lit only by the faintest glow of starlight filtering through narrow windows high above. It was here, in these darkened halls, that Zeus allowed his thoughts to drift. His steps were measured, echoing gently off the polished stone. He wore no sandals now, only a light robe that moved like smoke as he passed between pillars and alcoves. The chill of the floor grounded him, and the cool air against his face carried the quiet scent of cypress and moon-washed rock. There was a rhythm to this part of Olympus. It did not speak in language or light, but in presence. Each breath, each step, each pause was part of a larger pattern. Unwritten, unspoken, but deeply familiar. These walks were not escapes. They were returns. He came to a vaulted chamber, round and echoing, its ceiling disappearing into darkness above. In the center of the floor was a shallow basin carved into the stone, filled with water drawn from a spring that flowed only at night. The pool glowed faintly, not from light within, but from the starlight it reflected. It showed not just the stars above Olympus, but stars beyond sight, stars from memories, from long-lost nights, from skies that no longer existed. Zeus approached the basin and knelt beside it. He gazed into the reflection and saw not himself, but possibility. This was the chamber of silent water. Few gods visited it, and those who did often did so alone. It was not a place of prophecy. It was a place of presence. The pool did not show the future or answer questions. It showed stillness, and within that stillness the quiet shapes of understanding. Zeus placed one hand on the edge of the basin, feeling the cool stone, the thrum of deep time. The water did not ripple. His reflection remained absent. Only the stars looked back at him, each one pulsing faintly in the silence. He thought of the dreams mortals had, visions of flight, of fear, of love, of falling. He had watched them sleep, had heard their breath change as their minds slipped into places both beautiful and strange. Dreams, for mortals, were bridges between thought and emotion, memory and hope. For gods, dreams were something different, rarer, larger. When they came not as visions but as entire atmospheres, shifts in perception, in reality itself. A dream for a god could reshape the sky. But tonight Zeus did not seek such shifts. He sought only stillness. A faint breeze passed through the chamber, stirring his robe and the edge of the basin, but the water did not move. That was the nature of this place. Even wind respected its stillness. He closed his eyes not to sleep, but to listen, not with ears, but with presence. The night around him was vast, layered with silence and stars, like a library with no walls. And somewhere in that space, meaning drifted not as message but as moment. He stayed there, motionless, for a long time. Zeus opened his eyes slowly, allowing the starlit stillness to settle again around him. The chamber felt both ancient and immediate, like it belonged equally to the beginning of time and to the quiet now. He stood from his place beside the basin and moved without urgency toward one of the narrow archways that led deeper into the mountain. These passages were seldom walked even by gods. They did not lead to courts or gardens or terraces. They led inward, toward chambers that existed not for show, but for memory, for solitude, for the dreams gods carried not in their sleep, but in their waking silence. The path narrowed and dipped gently, winding through stone carved by thought rather than tool. The walls here bore no decoration, no columns or gold. They were smooth and dark, the surface slightly cool to the touch and marked faintly by veins of quartz that caught the low starlight and glimmered like frozen threads of lightning. Zeus walked slowly, his hand brushing the wall as he passed. He had made these halls long ago, not with force but with intention. A place where thought could echo gently and disappear without demand. A place where he could feel the quiet beneath all things. At the end of the path, the space opened into a low, circular chamber lit only by the natural glow of crystal embedded in the ceiling. These lights did not flicker or cast shadows. They glowed steadily, calmly, in shades of pale blue and silver. The floor was covered in woven mats made of mountain grasses, soft underfoot. In the center was a single bench, wide and unadorned, its wood darkened by age and use. Zeus approached and sat without hesitation, his shoulders relaxing the moment he exhaled. This chamber held no title, no name. It did not need one. It was a space of unspoken memory. Here, he let his thoughts come as they would, not guided, not pushed. They arrived like clouds at night, shapeless at first, then forming quietly. He thought of the early days, when the sky was still raw, and the stars had not yet found their places. He thought of Prometheus and the first fire, of the time Hera had laughed beneath a rainstorm, of a child's voice calling from a distant hill, not knowing the God who watched from above. These were not memories in the mortal sense. They were impressions, moments suspended in time, without edges, without conclusions. Sometimes he wondered what it meant to remember as a god. For mortals, memories were stories, bound in sequence and shaped by feeling. For him, memory was more like a field, wide, layered, always present. He could walk through it in any direction, touching moments like leaves on low branches, never out of reach. But it was the quiet ones that lingered, the ones without battles or prayers. A field of wheat swaying in silence, the sound of snow falling on temple roofs, a dove landing on a windowsill. These were the dreams he carried, the ones that stayed even when centuries passed. He leaned back on the bench and gazed upward, the crystal light outlining the sharp features of his face in blue and silver. His eyes did not search. They received. He did not want prophecy. He wanted only presence. There were no visions tonight, no flashes of distant futures or images of forgotten pasts. Only now, only the deep breath of night within the mountain's heart. And that was enough. He let his head rest against the cool wall behind him, his body quiet, his mind open. In this stillness, there was no need for thunder, no need for decision or decree. There was only the quiet rhythm of being, of presence, of understanding that did not require explanation. The kind of dream that gods rarely spoke of, but always remembered. Outside, the stars continued to move in their slow, ancient dance. And inside, the god of sky and storm rested, not in sleep, but in peace. Time passed in that quiet chamber. not measured in minutes or hours, but in the subtle shift of thought, the slow rise and fall of breath, the dimming glow of crystals as starlight moved beyond the mountain's crest. Zeus did not count the moments. He did not need to. The night held him not like a prisoner or a guest, but like a part of itself, one more presence in the rhythm of stillness. He stirred only when the silence began to feel full, no longer empty. That fullness, he had learned, marked the end of one pause and the quiet invitation of the next. He rose from the bench and stood for a moment in the center of the room. The air had grown cooler, touched by a draft from somewhere deeper still within Olympus. He welcomed it. Coolness reminded him of breath, and breath reminded him he was here, alive, aware, present. He moved toward the arched exit of the chamber and placed one hand on the frame of the doorway. The stone was cold and smooth beneath his fingertips, and he closed his eyes briefly, offering not a prayer, but a pause, a moment to acknowledge the stillness that had held him. Then he stepped back into the corridor, leaving behind no trace but memory. The walk back through the passage felt different. Not lighter, not faster, but changed. The halls seemed to carry more quiet than before. Not silence, but a resonance, like the aftermath of a deep note played on a lyre. Each step he took echoed gently, and he listened to them, not out of caution, but because there was a kind of music in motion. The night wrapped around him now, not as absence, but as presence. He did not hurry. There was no urgency in returning. The mountain had not changed in his brief absence. And yet, somehow, everything felt renewed. He passed once again the basin of silent water, still reflecting stars that could no longer be seen from the terrace. The pool had not rippled, not stirred, but its presence felt different now, as if it had absorbed something from the god who had knelt beside it. He did not stop this time. He only offered a glance, a knowing nod, then continued on toward the upper halls. The stars above were shifting toward dawn. He could feel it not in the sky, but in the stillness loosening, in the shadows becoming softer, in the silence preparing to yield to birdsong. Eventually he returned to one of the open arcades overlooking the eastern horizon. The air here was colder, touched by the edge of morning, and the sky was just beginning to brighten. No sun yet, only that faintest suggestion, the kind that lifts outlines into place before color arrives. Zeus stood at the edge, hands resting gently on the stone railing, and looked out over the world. It was still asleep, mostly. Cities lay in shadow. Rivers moved slowly. Even Olympus itself was quiet. But there, on the very rim of the world, a pale thread of gold began to stretch upward. He closed his eyes again, not in weariness, but in reception. The night was ending, but it had not gone unnoticed. It had been lived step by step, breath by breath, thought by quiet thought. And now, as the horizon opened its eyes and the first warmth of the new day stirred in the sky, Zeus stood not above it, but within it, a part of its unfolding, a god who had dreamed without sleep. The stars faded, one by one, like candles extinguished with care. And as they did, the light returned, slow, soft, and certain. Chapter 7: The Shape of Prayer. The first light of morning crept across Olympus like a quiet promise. It touched the highest stones and the softest leaves at once, offering neither command nor demand, only presence. For mortals, dawn meant the return of activity, of labor, of movement. For Zeus, it marked a different sort of beginning, not one of tasks or rule, but of observation. The world below would wake soon, and with that waking would come the soft surge of voices, many speaking aloud, most whispering within. These were prayers, and as the sky brightened, they would begin to rise. Prayer, Zeus had come to understand, was not always a request. It could be, yes, a cry for safety, a plea for harvest, a wish for love returned or danger averted. But beneath the surface of those words, prayer held other shapes. It was silence before a journey, a hand pressed to the heart in memory, a glance upward, offered without sound. These forms were not recorded, not sung, not burned in ritual fire, but he felt them. They did not pierce the sky. They settled into it, like dew upon grass, soft and persistent. And they found him not through effort, but through openness. He stood now in one of Olympus's upper chambers, a long hall open to the eastern horizon, where the clouds drifted slowly in layered pastels, lavender, blush, and soft gold. This space was built not to impress, but to listen. The marble was pale, veined with quartz and lined with benches that curved gently toward the center. No thrones stood here, no carvings of triumph or glory, only light, only space. This was where the prayers first reached, the ones carried not by voice, but by intention. And each morning, Zeus stood quietly to receive them, not as a god of thunder, but as a presence within sky and stone. He walked slowly to the edge of the chamber, where the wall gave way to open air. The breeze lifted his robe gently, cool and soft, like fingers brushing along fabric. He closed his eyes, and for a long moment simply listened, not to wind, but to something beneath it. A hum, a quiet rhythm, not sound in the ordinary sense, but something felt just beneath the skin. This was the music of thought turned outward, of hope, fear, gratitude, and grief, all folded into a single, endless breath that moved through the early light. As he listened, impressions formed, not as visions, but as shapes in the air. A woman kneeling in a field of young wheat, her hand resting on the earth. A boy staring into the sky with a wooden toy in one hand and questions in his heart. A soldier pressing fingers to the edge of a charm as he stepped onto a bridge. None of these souls knew if their gestures reached the heavens. None of them expected a reply, but they offered them anyway, not out of certainty but out of longing. That Zeus knew was the truest form of prayer. Not request, but reaching. He exhaled, slowly, and let the impressions pass through him. He did not need to intervene. Most prayers did not ask for miracles. They asked for presence, for knowing, for a sense that the sky listened, even if it answered with silence. And in that silence, there was sometimes more comfort than words could offer. He had learned long ago not to answer every call. To do so would be to undo the balance of mortal will. But to receive, to be present, that he could do, that he must do. A flock of birds passed in the distance, their wings catching light like polished bronze. They flew without prayer, but their motion itself was a kind of offering, a joining with the morning, with the current, with the breath of day as it unfolded. Zeus watched them, unmoving. Somewhere below, bells rang faintly. The start of work in a temple courtyard, the rising of a city from dreams. And with it, more prayers would rise, woven into footsteps and sweeping hands, into laughter and argument and song. He turned from the open air and walked once more along the length of the listening hall. The prayers would continue, as they always had. He did not need to hold them. He needed only to witness, and in that witnessing to honor them. As Zeus walked the hall, his hand brushed gently along the cool surface of the marble wall beside him. The stone had no inscriptions, no stories carved in triumph, no scenes of battles won or cities founded. It had been left bare by intention. This was not a place for declarations. It was a space for reception, for being within rather than above. The warmth of morning sun filtered through the high arches, tracing soft patterns across the floor. Each step he took was silent but purposeful, like punctuation in a thought not yet spoken. He paused by one of the inner columns where a single fig branch had taken root, improbably growing through a crack in the stone. No gardener had placed it there. It had not been blessed, nor trimmed. And yet it thrived year after year, its small green leaves shifting lightly in the breeze. He placed his hand on its trunk, fingertips resting against the warm bark. It was not strong, not grand, but it endured. That endurance, too, was a kind of prayer, not spoken aloud but lived, a wish not for change, but for continuation. He admired that. The sky beyond the arches was clearer now, the morning haze rising into brightening blue. The cities below would be fully awake. Thousands of hearts stirred with thought, and from each, something rose. Not all reached him. Not all were meant to. Some prayers never left the lips. Others never left the heart. But even those that remained unspoken carried weight. They shaped the world in small ways, in how someone chose kindness over anger or patience over haste. Those were not words carried by wind. They were choices, and choice, Zeus believed, was its own kind of sacred. He turned back toward the center of the hall where a shallow bowl sat upon a stone pedestal. It held no flame, no offering, only water, clear and still, fed from a spring deep beneath Olympus. The water had been placed there not to cleanse or bless, but to reflect. In it one could see the sky, the ceiling, and if one looked deeply enough, the shape of their own thoughts. Zeus stood before it now and looked down. His own face appeared, but softly, blurred by light and surface tension. Behind it, the arch of the sky. He reached into the water and let his fingers rest just below the surface. It cooled his skin instantly, spreading calm through his hand and wrist. No magic stirred, no vision appeared. Only water, only presence. He had placed this bowl here long ago for the same reason he walked these halls. To listen, not with ears but with being. The water knew no hierarchy. It did not favor prayer over silence, nor God over mortal. It reflected whatever was given, and in that it taught. He withdrew his hand and watched as the ripples smoothed again. He let the silence stretch. No one disturbed this place. Not Hermes with his quick footsteps, nor Apollo with his bright energy. Even Hera, with all her grace, rarely walked here. Not because it was forbidden, but because it required a kind of quiet that few embraced. Zeus found it comforting. It reminded him that divinity did not demand attention. It could simply be. A low wind passed through the arches, ruffling the edge of his robe and causing a faint murmur in the fig leaves. The sound was gentle, not unlike breath. He stepped back from the water and returned to the edge of the hall, where the view opened once more to the waking world. The light had sharpened now, bright and clean, lifting the final traces of shadow from the valleys below. He could see a caravan moving along a thin road, tiny figures from this height. Each one carried a day ahead of them, and in that day, prayers would rise again. Some shouted in joy, others whispered in despair. He would not answer them all. That had never been the task. But he would remain. He would listen. And sometimes listening was the most divine act of all. As the sun climbed higher, the chamber of listening began to shift. Shadows shortened, light grew clearer and more precise, and the air lost its morning coolness, warmed now by steady rays brushing the floor and walls. But the mood of the space did not change. Prayer did not belong to a single hour. Even as daily life resumed and mortal hands returned to tools, fields, scrolls, and songs, the essence of prayer continued, woven into gesture, into rhythm, into breath. Zeus knew this. He had come to see prayer not as a moment, but as a current, endless, invisible, and full of texture. He thought of those who prayed in words, reciting verses taught by elders or carved into temple walls. Their voices, earnest and measured, carried upward like slow-moving flames. But there were others too, those who offered nothing spoken, only intention. A farmer brushing soil from his fingers and glancing skyward. A widow pressing her palm to the doorframe before stepping into the quiet of her home. A child standing at a riverbank wondering what lay beyond the bend. These moments did not need language to reach the heavens. They arrived as they were, raw, honest, small, and therefore eternal. At the far end of the hall stood a tall window, open not to the sky, but to a narrow garden tucked against the mountain's inner ridge. It was quiet there, shaded and overgrown with herbs, wildflowers, and olive trees that grew in a small crescent around a weathered bench. Few visited it, but Zeus did from time to time, not to be seen, but to sit among things that grew without expectation. It was a place that reminded him how prayers did not always seek a response. Some simply wanted to exist, to be noticed, to rest in the knowledge that they were not alone. He turned from the view and slowly made his way toward that window, the fabric of his robe brushing softly along the stone. A vine of jasmine had crept into the hall, curling just below the sill. He knelt beside it and touched one of the small white blossoms, lifting it gently between two fingers. It trembled in his hand, not from fear, but from life. A delicate thing, temporary, and yet it had climbed this far, through stone and silence, reaching toward warmth. That too was prayer. He sat down by the window for a while, letting the mountain breathe around him. The scent of earth and blossom, the rustle of leaves, the quiet hum of life. These were voices as much as anything said in temples. In the world below, bells rang faintly again, signaling a moment of pause, a turning of task, or perhaps a meal shared. Somewhere, someone would light a candle. Somewhere else, someone would weep. A birth, a farewell, a hope, a fear. All of it rising through the air like unseen threads, carried not by sound, but by sincerity. Zeus closed his eyes and let it all pass through him. Not to judge, not to change, but to hold. For a breath, a moment, a stillness. He had learned slowly, and with time, that the most sacred thing he could offer was not power, but presence. Not dominion, but attention. The sky could rage with thunder, but it could also remain open and listening. And so, as the day stretched onward, and Olympus turned gently beneath the sun, the god of the sky remained seated in quiet witness. Not as ruler, not as judge, but as listener. Because in the end, every prayer, spoken or unspoken, simply asked for one thing, that someone or something was there. Chapter 8. Shadows in the Stone. The halls deep within Olympus held a different kind of quiet, one not shaped by light or wind, but by memory pressed into stone. These inner corridors, carved long before the world below had fully formed its rivers and mountains, were not built for ceremony or beauty. They were shaped for endurance, for keeping. They wound like thought through the bones of the mountain, their walls cool to the touch and dark even at midday. It was here that Zeus often walked when reflection required more than silence, when it required depth. These were the places where light could not follow, only echo. This day, as the sun passed its highest point and the upper terraces grew bright and warm, Zeus descended into the heart of Olympus. He carried no torch. He needed none. His eyes had long grown accustomed to the soft glow of the mountain itself, and his presence drew just enough luminance from the stone to see. The floor beneath his feet was made of volcanic glass, smooth, dark, and veined with old heat. It hummed faintly when walked upon, as if the mountain still remembered the fires that birthed it. Each step produced a tone, low and distant, like the voice of the world itself speaking from within. These passages were seldom traveled. Even other gods rarely ventured this deep, not out of fear, but out of reverence. The weight of age pressed gently against the walls, not threatening, but undeniable. Here time did not flow forward. It gathered, layered, folded into the stone like echoes into a canyon. The stories kept in these walls were not told aloud. They were felt, impressions left behind by thought, decision, and consequence. As Zeus moved deeper, he passed markers etched faintly into the stone. Not names, but symbols. Reminders of pacts made, moments weighed, truths too large for the surface. He reached a wide chamber without pillars, where the ceiling rose far above into shadow. In its center stood a great stone slab, its surface worn smooth by centuries of thought. This was the Chamber of Echoes, not named for sound, but for what remained after speech. Zeus stepped into the space and let the quiet settle. He did not speak. He did not need to. This place was made for the unsaid. The choices that had shaped him, those made in triumph, in error, in grief, had all passed through here. This was where he had come when he had first taken the sky. Where he had come again when he had considered giving it back. The stone beneath his feet shifted slightly, not from movement, but from memory responding to presence. The mountain did not think in words. It remembered in temperature, in resonance, in pattern. As Zeus walked to the center of the chamber and sat upon the slab, the floor warmed faintly beneath him. Not with fire, but with awareness. He placed his palms flat on the surface and closed his eyes. Slowly, deliberately, the weight of years, his years, rose around him like mist. Not visions, not ghosts, but shadows in the stone. He did not resist them. They came as they always did. The moment Prometheus defied him, the silence after Atlas was sentenced, the look in Hera's eyes when storms had come too soon. None of it surprised him. These moments were old companions. He did not argue with them anymore. He sat with them, let them move through him, let the stone hold them when he no longer could. This was not punishment. It was practice. The practice of remaining, of facing, of remembering not only what he had done, but why. The shadows passed gently. None stayed long. They did not accuse. They did not justify. They were only what they were, shapes left behind by action. Zeus exhaled slowly and lifted his hands from the stone. The surface cooled again, and the chamber returned to stillness. Above, somewhere far beyond the ceiling, birds might be circling. But here, there was only breath, and the quiet knowing that came from having lived many lives within one. He stood again, the echoes fading behind him, not erased, but settled. He did not carry them upward. He left them here, where they belonged, not buried, but honored. As he stepped from the chamber and back into the dark hallway, the mountain seemed to exhale softly, as if grateful for the visit. Zeus walked slowly through the corridor, the smooth stone beneath his feet now cooling with each step. The weight of memory still lingered on his shoulders, not as burden, but as acknowledgement. To lead was not simply to act, but to reflect. Olympus, for all its golden terraces and sunlit halls, was built on these foundations. Stone shaped by consequence, halls carved by time, and rooms like the Chamber of Echoes, where memory had permanence. It was in these darker places that he remembered not just who he was, but why he had become so. The hallway opened into a narrow vestibule with low ceilings and a shallow arch. A small pool rested in its center, fed by a thin stream that trickled from a crack in the wall. The water was clear and cold, gathering slowly and spilling over in steady rhythm. This was the spring of forgetting, not a place to erase memory, but to release its grip. It was a tradition, older even than the gods, to pause here after reflection, to dip one's hands and let the water remind you that while the past must be carried, it need not define the step ahead. Zeus knelt beside the pool, his knees brushing the cool stone. He dipped his hands in, the shock of cold refreshing rather than jarring. He closed his eyes, letting the water flow between his fingers. It made no demands. It offered no answers, but it moved constant, clear, untroubled. He had come here many times before, after moments of uncertainty or after long stretches of solitude. He had touched this water when the weight of command grew too heavy, when silence felt like absence instead of peace. Each time, the spring reminded him he was not only what he had done, he was also what he would choose next. He let the water drip from his hands back into the pool. The ripples spread outward in widening circles, overlapping gently. He watched them fade, then stood again. His reflection in the water had been faint, shadowed by the low light, but that too felt right. In these places he did not need to be seen. He only needed to be present. The mountain did not care for crowns, cared only for honesty, for presence. That was why these halls were quiet, not because they were forgotten, but because they were sacred in a way deeper than gold or glory. He turned and resumed his ascent, the stone passage curling back toward the surface in slow, deliberate spirals. Along the wall, faint carvings began to appear again. More recent ones, some from gods long vanished, others from the hands of mortals who had been granted brief entry in ages past. He ran his fingers along a line etched by a child, a name carved awkwardly into the wall, almost illegible. He remembered her, a mortal priestess, young and fierce, who once defied the storm to protect a grove of olive trees. He had watched from above, uncertain whether to intervene. In the end, she needed no thunder. She had needed only her resolve. She had lived, aged past, and left behind this name. By the time Zeus reached the upper chambers once more, the sun had shifted westward, casting golden light through the open arches of Olympus. The shadows in the stone were behind him, but their touch remained. Not heavy, not dark, but grounding. These reflections were not signs of doubt. They were signs of care. To look back was not to regret. It was to remember that even gods must carry themselves with grace. Not above their choices, but within them. The wind met him as he stepped back into the light, soft and clear, brushing the edge of his robe like a familiar hand. The mountain, having held his memory, now released him into the day once more. He stood for a moment, breathing in the crisp air, feeling it move through him like a second life. He had descended in silence. He returned not renewed, but realigned. There was still time in the day, still sky to watch, still prayers to hear, and above all, still choices to make, each one another mark in the endless stone of time. The golden air of late afternoon washed gently across the upper terraces as Zeus emerged fully from the depths of Olympus. The contrast between the mountain's quiet heart and its sunlit crown was always sharp, but never jarring. It was like surfacing from still water into open breeze, one silence yielding to another, softer in its brightness. The long walk through memory had not wearied him. Rather, it had anchored him. Now, standing once again amid the sky's wide expanse, he allowed the warmth to reach his skin and the wind to play through his hair like time brushing past his thoughts. He made his way slowly along the western colonnade, where the marble caught the light at gentle angles, glowing like sandstone touched by flame. From this height, the world below seemed distant but not disconnected. Small fields glittered in the sunlight. Rivers turned like threads of silk. Smoke curled peacefully from chimneys, not from destruction, but from bread, from warmth, from song. There was no crisis today, no battle demanding his hand. The sky did not stir with omens. And in this calm, Zeus found something even rarer than power: clarity. He paused beside a pomegranate tree growing in a large earthen vessel near the edge of the balustrade. Its branches were heavy with fruit, red and gold orbs hanging like thoughts ready to fall into meaning. He picked one carefully, turning it in his hand. The skin was warm from the sun, dappled with tiny specks of darker red. He held it for a while without opening it, simply observing its weight, its perfection, its silence. In another story, he might have cast it as a symbol, an omen, a message from fate. But today it was only fruit, and that was enough. Sitting on a nearby stone bench, he let the light settle around him. The mountain breathed, as did the sky, the sea, the hidden roots beneath Olympus. All of it held in quiet harmony, just for now. He thought again of the echoes below, of the basin of water that did not forget, of the spring that released the grip of grief. Each place had spoken not in thunder or command, but in presence. And perhaps that, too, was the role of a god, not always to act, not always to answer, but to remain, to hold space where mortals could reflect their own light. He looked at the pomegranate once more, then opened it gently. The skin split with a quiet sound, and within, the seeds glistened like garnet stars. He plucked one and placed it on his tongue. It burst with sweetness and just a hint of bitterness. Memory and promise side by side. He smiled faintly. The flavor was deep, familiar. It reminded him of Persephone and her long walk between worlds, of how choice and consequence could live in the smallest of things, of how even gods must taste both joy and restraint. The sun had begun to lower, casting the sky in softer gold. The first long shadows stretched across the terrace, and somewhere behind him, the faint sound of harp strings floated through the air. Perhaps Apollo practicing, or perhaps memory again. It did not matter. He listened, letting the music mingle with the taste of fruit and the rhythm of wind. The day was not yet done, but it no longer pressed forward. It eased. It released. It waited. Zeus leaned back against the stone, the warmth of the sun caught in the folds of his robe. In the distance, the world continued. People walking, fires burning, lives unfolding moment by moment. He watched not from above but from beside, not to change the day but to honor it. For in all the ages he had ruled, in all the storms he had summoned or silenced, this quiet, balanced moment was what remained most rare, most sacred. And so, as the light softened further and the pomegranate lay open beside him, Zeus remained where he was. No thunder rolled. No decree passed his lips. There was only presence, only sky, only stone, and the God who remembered all things, even as he let them go. Chapter 9. The Weight of Immortality. Evening descended on Olympus not as a moment, but as a process, layered, unfolding, filled with pauses and shifts of color that had no name. The bright gold of late afternoon gave way to quiet amber, then to a blue that deepened almost imperceptibly with each breath. The world below continued its motion. Fires kindled, gates latched, voices lowered, but on the mountaintop, a hush began to settle like a soft mantle. In this hour, when light bowed out and shadow rose without threat, Zeus often turned his mind to the quiet subject few dared name aloud: the weight of eternity. Immortality was not a crown. It was not glory. It was not the endless celebration mortals imagined. It was a kind of stillness beneath motion, a vastness within the self. To live forever was to carry not just memory, but every shape memory had ever taken. Zeus, seated now beneath a cypress that leaned slightly westward from centuries of wind, could feel that weight, not heavy in the bones, but in the spaces between moments. It was the accumulation of choices that no longer had consequence, of love that could not be lost because it had already been, and of time that stretched onward without horizon. He watched as the stars began to emerge, one by one, like cautious notes played on a distant lyre. Some were new to the sky. Others had shone since before even he had risen to power. There was a kind of intimacy in knowing them all. Not by name, they had too many for that, but by rhythm. Each star pulsed at a frequency that felt like a breath, and together they formed a song that only the eternal could fully hear. It was not loud. It did not demand attention. But it was always there, beneath thought, beneath sound. Beneath the turning of the world, Zeus reached beside him and picked up a piece of smooth obsidian, one of many he kept near this perch. It fit comfortably in his palm, cool and solid, its surface holding reflections not quite true. He often kept these stones nearby, not for their power but for their silence. They reminded him of what could not be shaped, what could only be held. He turned it slowly in his hand, feeling its weight, its refusal to change, its simplicity. The stone did not grow old. It did not hunger or yearn. It simply remained. And yet it was not alive. That, he knew, made all the difference. He thought then of the other gods, of Hera, still poised and deliberate, her patience vast but not eternal, of Poseidon, forever pulled between depths and storms, of Hades, his brother of silence, whose realm bore the finality even Olympus could not claim. They, too, knew the shape of immortality. Each carried it differently. Some resisted, some embraced, some pretended they did not notice. But all of them, at one time or another, had looked to Zeus not as king, but as mirror. For he was the one who had lasted longest in the sky, the one who had stood above without stepping away, the one who bore memory in stillness, not fire. He let the obsidian fall gently back onto the stone shelf and rested his elbows on his knees, hands clasped. The night wrapped around him now, cooler and fuller, but not cold. The moon had not yet risen, but its pull could be felt in the shifting of leaves, in the patience of the breeze. It was strange, he thought, how even now, after all the wars, all the thrones, all the prayers, what remained most difficult was simply being. Not acting, not judging, being. For mortals, the struggle was to matter in briefness. For the gods, the struggle was to remain whole across endlessness. And yet, here he was, not drifting, not hiding, still present, still shaped by memory, by the wind, by the stars that continued to shine even when no one looked. Zeus lifted his gaze to the sky and watched as another star blinked into view. It had been there long before him. It would remain long after. And still he stayed. As the night deepened, the mountain grew quieter. Not in absence, but in refinement. The winds softened, brushing only the highest treetops. The stars multiplied slowly, spreading across the black canvas with a grace that never ceased to feel deliberate. Zeus remained seated beneath the old cypress, his eyes fixed not on any single point, but on the whole. The sky had always been his domain, but it never stopped humbling him. Each star was a breath, each constellation a memory, and in the stillness, the shape of forever pressed against the edges of thought like ocean against stone. Immortality, for all its mystery, was not some glittering prize. It was repetition with variation, stillness within motion. It was watching the same truths take new forms century after century. Love reshaped as loyalty, as rebellion, as devotion. Suffering reborn through war, through illness, through longing. Joy unfolding in birth, in union, in sudden laughter under open sky. None of it was new, and yet all of it felt new to those living it. That, Zeus had realized long ago, was what kept him steady. The mortal's ability to feel wonder, even when the gods could not. He had once envied them that intensity, that finality, the brief span in which to live and love and lose, which gave everything its edge. Immortality dulled edges. It smoothed the soul over time, not by intent, but by necessity. There were only so many songs one could hear before lyrics became patterns. Only so many sunrises one could witness before beauty became silence. And yet, it was in watching mortals live that Zeus found clarity. They reminded him that time was not merely something to endure, it was something to hold. He rose slowly from the bench and walked across the terrace. Beneath his bare feet, the stones were warm from the day's sun but cooling now with each passing moment. He moved without sound, not out of effort but out of long practice. The stars did not demand quiet, but they seemed to welcome it. In one of the upper alcoves, a small sculpture stood, a simple shape, abstract, rough-hewn. It had been carved by a mortal craftsman centuries ago, a gift left on the mountain in a time when offerings were made not from obligation, but from awe. Zeus often came to this sculpture at night. It was not beautiful in the traditional sense. It had no clear form, no face, no gesture. But that was why it remained. Its meaning shifted with each century. Sometimes it looked like a flame, sometimes a wave, sometimes a pair of wings. Tonight it looked like a door, a quiet threshold. He rested his hand gently on its surface, feeling the faint dips where fingers had passed before, mortal and divine. It was a symbol but not of power, of presence. Someone had once believed enough to shape it, to offer it, to trust that it would be seen. He lowered his hand and stood beside it in silence, watching the stars. Immortality, he thought again, was not about being remembered forever. It was about being present long enough to see the truth come around again in a different face, a different voice, a different question. It was not about controlling the world below. It was about understanding it, witnessing it without becoming separate from it. The weight came not from being eternal, but from staying open within that eternity. Far below, a dog barked. Somewhere else, a child likely turned in sleep. In another part of the world, a prayer might rise, unspoken and quiet, like dew forming on stone. Zeus heard it all not as 1,000 voices, but as a single current, life continuing, mortality moving forward, and himself still here, still within it. He stepped away from the sculpture and returned to the edge of the terrace. A breeze caught the hem of his robe, and the stars shimmered more fully now, unhindered by cloud or mist. The sky was vast and unconcerned, and yet it listened, so he stayed. The moon had risen now, casting pale silver across the terraces of Olympus. Its light was softer than the sun's, but in many ways more revealing. Where daylight burned away shadow, moonlight allowed it to remain, to breathe, to exist as part of the whole. Zeus stood beneath that gentle glow, feeling its presence settle on his shoulders not like burden, but like understanding. There were nights when the silence of the mountain felt like a mirror, reflecting back not who he had been, but who he continued to become. Immortality was not a fixed state. It was a becoming without end. He moved slowly through a row of olive trees near the western ledge, their gnarled trunks twisted by time and wind. These trees had grown from the same roots planted long ago, some even by his own hand, in an age before the world had divided gods from mortals so sharply. Their branches swayed with a rhythm that echoed memory more than weather. He ran his fingers along one of the limbs, the bark rough and cool. How many seasons had passed since it first stretched skyward? How many leaves had fallen, grown again, fallen once more? The tree remembered in silence. So did he. He found a seat carved from stone beneath one of the older trees and lowered himself with a quiet breath. Above, the stars continued their quiet song. He watched them without naming them. Their constellations were familiar, but tonight, he let them simply exist. Light, distance, ancient energy still arriving. He did not need their meaning. He only needed their presence. Like the soft breeze, like the pulse of water in the springs below, like the scent of old wood and mountain grass. All of it held him without demanding anything. In those moments, even a god could feel small. And that smallness, he knew, was sacred for all the power he held, for the storms he could summon, the skies he could darken, the thunder he could call with a single word. It was the stillness that carried the deepest truth. Creation did not always roar. Sometimes it whispered. Sometimes it waited. Sometimes it simply endured. He closed his eyes and listened, not to wind, not to prayer, but to that which lived beneath both. The quiet that came not from absence, but from completeness. Not emptiness, but fullness that needed no display. He thought of the others who had come and gone, of gods now forgotten, their names lost to sand and time, of mortals who had touched his heart in fleeting moments, some who had looked to him in faith, others who had looked away in defiance. Each had left an impression, not etched in stone, but held in the endless fold of memory. He had not loved all of them. He had not judged all of them, but he had watched, and in watching, he had carried them with him through the centuries. That, too, was a kind of immortality, not to be remembered but to be held. The moonlight grew brighter as the orb climbed higher, painting long shadows across the floor of the grove. One fell across his lap, a dark ribbon stretching toward the far wall. He followed its shape with his eyes, then with his hand. It moved as he moved, but not with weight, just with echo. That was what eternity was in the end. Not permanence, but echo. The way one moment repeated in the next, never the same, but never entirely gone. A touch of a leaf, a glint of starlight, a memory that rose not from thought, but from being. He remained beneath the olive tree until the moon reached its zenith. No words passed his lips. No decree left his hands. There was no need. The weight he bore was not heavier than any other night. But tonight it had shape. Tonight it had space to be felt. And that made all the difference. When he stood at last, the leaves above him rustled softly, as if in farewell or perhaps simply in rhythm. He placed one hand on the old trunk once more, then turned back toward the heart of Olympus. Still present, still walking, still becoming. Chapter 10. When Sky Meets Silence. The final hours of night on Olympus were unlike any other part of the day. They held a quiet that was not absence, but anticipation. A stillness that seemed to listen more than the world itself. The stars above remained sharp, bold in the sky, but they no longer shone with the crispness of midnight. Their edges had softened, as if they too were preparing to retreat. Beneath them, the mountains seemed to breathe slower, deeper, wrapped in the hush before dawn. And it was here, in this liminal moment, that Zeus often found the clearest sense of what it meant to be. He stood at the highest point of Olympus, a wide, flat platform of polished stone that reached into the sky like a question never fully asked. From here, the world below stretched in all directions. Oceans silvered by starlight, forests wrapped in blue shadow, cities asleep in soft clusters of light. Above him, only the stars and the weight of open space. He had stood here countless times, at the edge of night, at the edge of thought, and each time, the same feeling settled over him. Not loneliness, not even awe, but presence, complete, vast, and quiet. The wind here was different, steady and cool, with no scent but altitude, passed through him like breath, reminding him that even gods had rhythms. He spread his arms slightly, letting the air move through the folds of his robe, letting it remind him that he was not outside this world, but within it. The height did not separate him. It revealed him. Beneath it all, the prayers, the rituals, the myths, the memory, he was above all a watcher. a witness, a participant in something older and wider than any throne. He closed his eyes. The silence wrapped tighter. This was not a silence to be broken. It was a silence to be held. The kind of stillness that carried meaning not in sound, but in the space where sound might have been. He breathed slowly, deeply, and in the breath he felt the entire arc of his existence. Birth from stone and storm, rise through conflict, eons of memory, eons of choice. There had been times when he wielded power like a sword, times when he had rested in arrogance, times when he had questioned the very idea of eternity. But here now none of that mattered. What mattered was that he had endured, not unchanged but still becoming. Behind him, the eastern horizon began its earliest shift. Not light yet, but the thinning of dark. A gradient so faint only the gods could detect it. It would be some time before the sun rose, before the golden threads of day stretched across the sky once more. But already the air had changed. The world was readying itself again. He remained still, hands at his sides, eyes closed. There was nothing more to reach for, nothing more to claim. Only this, a final breath of night, a final thought beneath stars. And in that moment, something within him released, not with force, but with grace. A loosening of memory, a softening of weight, not forgetting, but forgiving, not of others, but of himself. The sky above did not notice. The stars did not shift. But within the stillness, something aligned. Something let go. Zeus opened his eyes slowly, and the sky greeted him with its deep, fading indigo. A color found only in the final moments before morning begins. He stood still for a while longer, not to delay, but to honor what remained. These last breaths of night were sacred, not because of mystery, but because of simplicity. There was no thunder here, no divine sign, no celestial decree, just wind, sky, and the slow turning of the world. He stepped forward to the very edge of the stone platform, where the mountain gave way to the vast air. From this height, the horizon was a curve, not a line. Beneath that curve, mortals still dreamed. Some stirred in their beds, unaware of the day rising just beyond their reach. Others held on to sleep, chasing remnants of stories that would vanish with the light. Zeus watched over them, not with judgment, not even with protection, but with care, with the quiet understanding of one who had seen every shape of their lives. Their joys, their errors, their moments of courage, their silent fears. He had never been all-knowing, not in the way legends claimed, but he had always been present, and that, he had come to believe, was more meaningful. He knelt slowly, one knee touching the stone, his hand brushing across the rough edge of the platform. The mountain beneath him hummed with the deep, slow rhythm of age. It was not a divine hum. It was the hum of earth, of time, of things that existed long before names were given. He pressed his palm flat against the rock, feeling the coolness of night still clinging to its surface. A breath passed through him, not drawn, but released. He did not speak. There was no one to speak to. But in his silence, a kind of conversation unfolded, one between him and the moment itself. From this height, he could see the beginning of light touching the lowest clouds on the far edge of the world. Not the sun itself, but the idea of it, the promise. It painted the clouds in the faintest gold, a color that didn't yet reflect but hovered, like memory. He thought of Helios preparing his chariot far across the sky, the horses restless with flame. Soon they would race, soon the day would break, soon the world would awaken. But not yet, for now time still held its breath. Zeus stood again, the movement slow and deliberate. He turned his gaze not outward, but upward. The last stars still shimmered, stubborn in their glow, refusing to vanish entirely. One in particular caught his eye, not the brightest, not the most famous, but steady, quiet, familiar. He had no name for it, though it had likely been named by mortals dozens of times. To him, it was simply a companion, one that had always been there in these final minutes of night. He raised a hand, not to grasp it, not to control, but to acknowledge. A silent greeting between sky and God. He let his hand fall again and lowered his eyes toward the horizon. The light was growing now, subtly but surely, the colors shifting from blue to lavender to the faintest blush of rose. The moment between night and day, this fragile, fleeting breath, was ending. And with it, so too would the quiet that wrapped the mountain in its spell. Birds would begin to stir. Clouds would thicken and move. The world would begin again as it always did. But he had been here to witness its turning. That was his ritual. Not thunder, not spectacle, just this. He stepped back from the edge, his robe catching the wind like a sail, not seeking direction, but balance. There was no destination now, only movement. He walked across the platform with the calm stride of one who knew not just where he was, but why he remained. Olympus would wake soon. The sky would glow. The world would sing again. And he would be there, not above it, but with it. Still, always. Zeus descended from the high platform without urgency. His steps quiet along the smooth stone path that wound gently down toward the eastern terraces. The mountain behind him remained wrapped in the softest layers of light, neither fully dark nor entirely bright, a color that could only exist between worlds. As he walked, he felt not the march of time, but its unfolding. Each moment revealed itself gently, like a leaf unfurling after long stillness. This was the rhythm of Olympus in its quietest form. Not the voice of gods, not the chant of mortals, just breath, just motion, just being. He passed a row of tall columns where ivy had crept higher than before. It always grew overnight, weaving its patterns silently, indifferent to thrones and thunder. He paused and traced a finger along one of the leaves. Morning dew clung to its surface, cool and clear. It was not a miracle. It was not a symbol. It was simply there. And in its smallness, it reminded him of the truth he had spent eternity learning. The divine was not found only in might or mystery, but in presence. In the way a leaf held light. In the silence before a bird's first song. In the moments when the world did not ask anything of him, and he did not ask anything of it. He reached one of the outer courtyards, a circular space with a mosaic floor depicting the seasons in long, spiraling ribbons. He had walked it many times, each step once matching a part of the year's cycle. But this morning he did not follow its path. He simply crossed it, pausing briefly in its center where the lines converged in a small golden sunburst. Above him, the first true rays of sunlight pierced the sky, casting long shadows and golden warmth across the courtyard. The day had begun, not announced, not declared, just arrived. As it always had and always would, Zeus lifted his head and let the sunlight touch his face. It was gentle at first, not yet strong, like a memory becoming real. He closed his eyes and stood there, letting it pass through him, not to bless, not to judge, but to be received. Around him, Olympus stirred softly. In distant halls, the faint sound of lyres. From the kitchens, the first curls of warmth rising with the scent of bread. From the far edge of the mountain, the wings of birds catching air. The world was awakening, and he was within it. He opened his eyes and exhaled slowly. There would be other days, other choices, other prayers. He would hear them all as he always had, not as ruler, not as legend, but as presence, as the sky that remained above, not to command, but to hold. The storm would return in time, lightning would find its moment again. But not today. Today was for light, for quiet, for the peace that comes not from answers, but from knowing you do not need them, with one last glance toward the horizon, now golden and full of promise. He turned and began to walk toward the inner halls of Olympus. His pace was unhurried, his footsteps light, his mind calm. The mountain received him, and he moved within its breath like part of its rhythm. There was no task before him, no call for decision, only the continuation of being. And as he passed beneath the archway that led back into the marble corridors, the wind behind him lifted slightly, catching the hem of his robe and sending it fluttering for a moment, like a banner not of war, but of stillness. Above, the stars faded. Below, the world turned once more. Zeus did not speak. He did not need to. He was there. He was always there. And in that quiet truth, the sky found its shape again. The end. If you found peace in this quiet moment with Zeus, consider subscribing and liking the video to support more calm journeys through time, myth, and memory. Thank you for listening.